Welcome to the Top Class podcast with me, Chris Moore. In schools, in many places worldwide, it's exam season. Sitting tests, waiting for or collecting results, it's a stressful time which many of us, unfortunately, are all too familiar with their futures at stake as they enter an ever-changing higher education and job market. Students deserve a system that's fair. My guest, Ruth Johnson, is Assessment Director at one of the United Kingdom's top exam boards, Cambridge OCR. She's in charge of the assessment process from setting papers through to marking. Thanks so much for talking to us, Ruth. I have to ask you to start off with, you're responsible for setting exams now. What was your own experience of sitting them?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's interesting. So I think probably in common with quite a lot of people who work in the exam world, I quite liked exams. I did well in them. I did well in my what were O levels and A levels back then in the UK, and it was a very sort of traditional set of exams. We didn't mostly do coursework, although there was some in some subjects. But yeah, I enjoyed exams. I felt that I thrived in them, and I know that that's not the case for everybody. So it's an interesting reflection, really, that this is where I've kind of ended up. And not many people, I think it's fair to say, grow up thinking I want to work for an exam board. But I think people kind of end up there via an interest in education and an interest in ensuring the right outcomes for students.
And do you think exams still are the best form of assessment compared to the various alternatives?
I think it depends by what measure you're assessing what's best. I don't think it's true to say that exams are always the most authentic form of assessment. I think lots of things in an ideal world you would assess in a more authentic environment, through coursework and observed practice. But I think for the world that we're in, they're probably the fairest form of assessment, in that it's really just a student in a room and it's their knowledge and skills that's being assessed. And there's no other kind of factors that can influence that. I think if you look across the world, where exams have come in and when they've come in, it's been because the systems that were in existence before that often gave preferment to people in quite privileged positions. So people got into university or into jobs because of who they knew, not what they could do. And I think where exams, you can see a kind of a pattern globally where exams are introduced, it's to try and counter that kind of thing.
In terms of meritocracy, I guess what you're saying is that it's generally the best method.
Yeah, I think so. But you could also ask the question about, what's the most resilient method from a system point of view? And I think we saw during the pandemic through COVID that the systems which had non-linear exams, so multiple opportunities across a year to take parts of an assessment and different kinds of assessments, so more embedded coursework and that kind of thing, they were much more resilient to a big upset, which meant that at a particular point in the year people couldn't be in schools.
If we're looking at the exam itself, what makes a fair exam?
There's a number of factors that make an exam fair. So firstly, there needs to be no surprises on the exam. The exam needs to be testing exactly what students think it's going to test, in a way that feels quite familiar to them. So there's nothing that's going to upset them or trip them up in the exam. But an exam also needs to be just testing the construct that it's meant to be assessing. So what you don't want are questions which either advantage or disadvantage students based on something that they know outside the construct of the exam. For example, the kinds of experiences they've had in life or their cultural knowledge. So you don't want things which have context, for instance, questions that have context that might be unfamiliar to students because of their social and cultural experiences. I think a fair exam also needs to be something which is accessible to the widest range of students. So we obviously make adaptations to our exams for students with different needs. So we produce braille papers and large print papers and other kinds of adaptations. So a fair exam needs to be something which lends itself readily to that. It also needs to be something which is comparable to other exams across time. You don't want students in one year to be advantaged or disadvantaged against students in previous years or subsequent years because the exam is a bit more difficult or a bit more accessible or a bit more easy. So we within our system, we have ways of ensuring that if there is a bit of difference in the demand each year, then we can adapt for that in our grading process. And it's also the case, I think, when you know, research has shown that when you get a new qualification, so at the very start of a new syllabus, sometimes, you know, there aren't many test papers available, there aren't many textbooks available, teachers aren't very familiar with it. So students' performance can dip, but they shouldn't be disadvantaged just because they're at the start of an exam, a new exam. So the processes by which we set standards also ensure that it's fair for them. So the grade boundaries, when we're grading the exams, make allowances for that.
How do you come up with the questions? How do you choose them? And how do the considerations that you've just been talking about feed into that choice?
Every exam paper starts with a blueprint, which defines things like the content to be assessed, the skills, what percentage of the different kinds of skills, what marks there need to be available. So that's the blueprint. But also the other things that go into it are the training of the examiners. So we have a set of accessibility principles, which include things from use of language and context through to use of colour, font, layout, and so on. So all those things go into training for our examiners. And then we commission our assessment writers to go away and produce a paper or a set of questions on the basis of the blueprint and the kinds of training that they've had. But then it's a really long process. It doesn't just happen, you know, it's not just a few people writing some things on a piece of paper and there you go. It, you know, there's a long and iterative process that goes on for months and months where different people see the questions and see the paper and evaluate them. So, you know, there's somebody who sits the whole paper once it's ready from end to end as if they were a student to make sure that all the questions function as we thought they would, and that there's no kind of hidden barriers or any mistakes in there.
You talked a little bit earlier about exams that were too hard. You hear these various, not exactly scandals, but kind of nightmares reported in the media. I read a few myself about, you know, you get anecdotal evidence of a lot of students turning up for exam and them all finding it really, really difficult. How do you correct that?
I think it's really inexcusable when that happens, actually. But it's also not impossible, because I think, you know, you don't, because within the English system we don't pre-test our questions like they do in some other jurisdictions. Everybody who writes that paper, everybody involved in the question paper, the quality assurance process, they're all adults who are some distance from the classroom. Some of them are teachers, and I think you absolutely need that so that they have a good sense of how things will land with students. But they are ultimately adults, and so, you know, all these adults can think, oh, this is a good paper and this is going to, you know, they'll definitely be okay with this. But ultimately, if the students don't get it, then it can be much more difficult than they really anticipated it would be. If that happens, the process by which we set standards, so grade boundaries, takes that into account. So we use a lot of data in that process, looking at the prior attainment of the students and how the different items have functioned, to make sure that if the paper is difficult, then the grade boundaries will be lower in previous years. And I think in our system, most people understand that. And my daughter did A-level physics in a year when the exam was quite a difficult exam, and she came out and everybody was, you know, saying, oh, this was a really difficult exam. And her teacher just said, oh, don't worry, just mean the grade boundaries will be lower. It does get corrected for, but you don't want that situation, because what you don't want is students in an exam being in distress. You know, they should have a positive experience where they feel like it's a fair judge of the things that they know and can do. And if they find it more difficult than they expected, then they're not having that experience.
We've just talked about things being too difficult. What about if it's too predictable?
I mean, you don't want an exam to be too predictable. It's challenging, actually, to manage all the different factors, because we don't reuse questions in our papers, which when a qualification has been going for quite a number of years, actually makes it quite challenging to continue to set questions. And so you need to refresh your qualifications fairly regularly to avoid that situation. But yeah, you don't want people coming into a test where they've prepared the answers before they come in, because actually I don't think that necessarily does does anybody any favours. I remember years ago meeting a group of teachers. These were English teachers, and on the exam that they'd been preparing for, there was an unseen poem. And one year, just by chance, a teacher had taught the poem in a lesson, and they discussed it and so on. And it ended up just by chance being the unseen poem. And her students didn't do very well because they were trying to remember what they'd written or what they'd said in response to this unseen poem in the lesson, rather than having a personal response to it and answering the question as they would have done had they never come across it before. So you don't want people trying to recall things that they've already kind of written in preparation for previous questions. You want them to fully engage with the question that they see in front of them.
We've talked about, too difficult, too predictable. Is there room for, or what is the space for innovation in terms of coming up with each year's format?
There's obviously a lot of space for innovation and creativity in education. I think being a teacher is a really creative job, actually. You want to think of innovative and interesting ways to get your students engaged in a subject and to learn the things that they have to learn. I think largely an exam paper is not the space for that. If an exam setter is trying to be really creative and innovative, they risk upsetting the student. They risk putting in place barriers that shouldn't be there. In some ways, I think an exam should be quite boring because it just needs to be a thing that doesn't have any surprises. And I think if someone's trying to be too creative, they can really upset a student's equilibrium.
What's the best way to assess more complex abilities, ones where students can't just have a checklist of stuff that they're able to regurgitate in the exam?
Where you're testing higher order skills, the construct often includes the ability to apply their knowledge and understanding to unfamiliar contexts. But it's really a challenge, quite a fine line for a setter to tread, finding an unfamiliar context which doesn't disadvantage or advantage students based on the prior understanding of that context. It's a challenging thing to do, but that's obviously one thing that you do need to do, to take what you've learned and be able to think about it in relation to something else. I think other higher order skills that can be tested within exams are the ability to evaluate and synthesize information. Whatever that information is, it needs to be completely in line with the thing that the test is setting out to test. It can't be anything outside that that makes the exam less valid. But I think sometimes those higher order skills, there's only so far you can test them in exam settings, I think. There are other kinds of assessment that some skills are better suited to being assessed in, more longer form, detailed coursework type activity. But the challenge there in 2026 is how you ensure that work is authentic in the world of AI, and that's proving massively challenging across the entire education sector. AI is clearly a tool which is here to benefit us in many ways, but it's unfortunately undermining those kinds of authentic assessments that can test that more research-based synthesizing, summarizing and evaluating that non-examined assessment is really good for.
In terms of cheating in coursework, or at least getting AI to help you in coursework, that's been a huge game changer, surely, in terms of how we set up assessment systems.
Yeah, it has. And we hear lots of things from our teachers. And we've done quite a bit of research on this. And lots of teachers tell us they generally know if a student's work is not their own. That said, it's a really difficult thing to manage in schools. If students are always producing things where you've got to have that question in the back of your head. And so schools and teachers would really like a kind of fail-safe way to be able to say, we can see that X% of this work is not yours. And currently the systems for detection are not as fail-safe as we might like them to be. So it is a real challenge. I think in the future, we probably need to be moving to a place where AI use in non-examined assessment isn't malpractice, And that's either because the thing that's being assessed in that non-examined assessment is something where you wouldn't get any benefit from it from using AI. So you're demonstrating something practical, whether it's a work-based skill or something like drama or music or some sort of creative art, making something. Or the assessment is set up in such a way that students can use AI, but they can use it in a way where they've got to be absolutely transparent about their use of it. And part of that assessment is, it becomes part of the construct, evaluating the use of it and so on. The other way to approach it is in using different kinds of assessment to validate the work. So there's been some discussion about things like bringing vivas, oral assessments into school exams, which I think is if you're in a small school with, small class sizes, is probably fairly manageable. But I know in a huge sixth form or a college with thousands of people, it becomes a lot more challenging. So finding our way through this over the next few years, I think, is going to be a challenge, but we're certainly going to have to adapt the way that we do things, I think.
People in a lot of professions are, coming to that conclusion. It's AI is there. Whatever we think of it, we've got to deal with it. How much time are you and your colleagues spending thinking about it and thinking how we can make this work for us?
A fair bit, to be honest. When I say a fair bit, I mean a lot, because it's touching every aspect of life, as you say. So we've talked about the impact on students and assessment, but obviously, as exam boards and as both as Cambridge OCR and as Cambridge University Press and Assessment, which Cambridge OCR sits within, we're looking across what AI can do for the system, and that's whether that's in using AI in producing question papers, not necessarily to create questions, although that's certainly something that we're looking at, but having AI within those quality assurance loops to do things like detect errors and eradicate errors, detect content that's not on the qualification, and make sure that doesn't come up on exams, because it's a very human process at the moment. Sometimes there are errors, and to get to a place where there were no mistakes on any exam paper would be brilliant. We're also looking at whether AI can support marking, again, not necessarily as the prime marker, but within the quality assurance process, if it can detect markers that are not marking to the agreed standard, that would be a real win for the quality of marking. So yeah, lots of different ways, but always currently retaining a human in the loop.
Is it going to end up with all of our papers being marked by a robot?
Not anytime soon, but there are some question types where for many years technology has been marking them in some cases, not actually within Cambridge OCR, but in many exam boards where you've had multiple choice questions for decades. They've been read automatically by machines and marked automatically by machines. So there are some things I think where it'd be quite straightforward for a robot to mark an exam question. But there are some where I think we're quite a way off that being done in a consistent and valid way. I think we might get to a place where it can be done reliably, but I think whether we do it would be another question, because I'm not sure that students and their parents will necessarily accept marking by technology readily or quickly. But I'm sure that one day we'll get there, and everyone will accept it because that's the way the world is. But it's not yet.
In terms of areas where AI is not up to scratch yet, you're talking about long history essays, long English essays, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, there's all kinds of barriers. I mean, the first barrier for most exams is that they're taken on paper in England, and so getting them reliably transcribed in a way which can be read and automatically marked is the first barrier. But you're absolutely right. Making sure that those kinds of extended response items, essays where students are having to use higher order skills to bring together and evaluate information, rather than just being kind of knowledge-based, right or wrong type answers, they'll be the most challenging.
Kind of puts the onus on exams, doesn't it? Because it's the area in which it's most difficult to cheat.
Yeah, absolutely, it does. That you kind of get the pendulum in England. You get the pendulum swinging between assessments which include a lot of non-examined assessment and, a fairly balanced mix of exams and non-exams, back to much more exam-based. But the pendulum has switched before, just kind of culturally, whereas now the pendulum is swinging away from non-examined assessment, I think, because of this factor. So it does put a lot of pressure on exams as being, as you say, the place where students find it difficult to cheat. That said, technology is obviously cropping up in discussions this year with the use of AI supported glasses and so on. The kinds of technologies that are, we've long banned phones in the exam room, and they're fairly easy to spot, but more and more technology is becoming less easy to spot, and so that's something that we're always having to adapt to and find ways to deal with.
Going back to the idea of how you come up with exam designs, is AI going to play a prominent role there?
It's an interesting question, actually. And sometimes I play around with readily available search engine just to see what it would do if you asked it to produce a question paper for a particular exam board. And it does something, but I don't think yet it's the quality that you'd really expect it to be. I'm sort of thinking more about kind of specification design and right back at the beginning when you're thinking, right, well, what skills do you want to assess on this kind of test or this kind of assessment? I wonder whether there's something there about it being able to, AI being able to readily draw from a much wider knowledge base than a human could to come up with some, the very high level specification. That, I think that could be an interesting area to explore. But I think actually, from an exam board perspective, the way that we'll use it more quickly is in teacher support areas, actually. Teachers, we've already said it takes, months and months, over a year, to produce an exam paper. And what teachers really need at the start of a specification is lots of test papers to show their students what the questions look like. If we can get AI to produce questions for that, so they're not high stakes, they're not subject to lots of controls and security because they're not going to be set by students in a high stakes environment. If we could use AI for that, then I think we could really support teachers much more readily. And I know within the classroom, teachers are already using lots of that kind of tool to support their students and do lots of formative testing.
How do you seek to maintain trust in the system over the years, over quite a long period of time?
When something happens, it really shakes trust in the system. When there's an error on an exam, when an exam is more difficult than it should be, when it makes it into the press, those kinds of things do shake trust in the system. And I think it's not just, England has multiple exam boards. And I think when any exam board has an error, it doesn't just reflect on them, it reflects on the whole system and shakes trust in the system. So I think we're all in it together from that perspective. So I think we maintain trust in the system by maintaining the quality of what we do, making sure all exams are valid, making sure that they're marked reliably, that students get the grades which seem like a fair reflection to them of what they've done. When any of those things aren't in place, then trust wobbles, I think.
How do you see the exams of the future?
I feel like we've been saying this for about 30 years, but at some point exams will be on screen because that's how everybody else works, isn't it? There aren't many large-scale exams in the UK, in England, that take place on screen. There are some, but not many. And some of the reasons for that are to do with the sorts of infrastructure that's needed. Because our system, which is not the same as all systems, because all our exams happen at the same time on the same day, having a school having the infrastructure to do GCSE English, where they might have 300 students taking an exam, or with no computers falling over, is a big challenge. And I don't think we're necessarily in that place yet. That said, for many things, exams on screen are a more authentic assessment of the subject. So computer science, for instance, currently, in many cases, is a paper-based exam. which is crazy, really, because they're studying computer science. So for things like that, I think we need to move to on-screen assessment quite quickly, and Cambridge OCR are working on that at the moment. And our sister organisation, Cambridge International, are moving several of their exams on screen over the next few years. So there's definitely a move towards on-screen exams, but we can only move as quickly as the sort of the least well equipped school in some ways. But yeah, that's where we'll get to. But I wouldn't want to kind of even guess at the timeline, because, as I say, people have been saying for 30 years, by 5 years, in 5 years' time, all exams will be on computers, and many kinds of exams across the world are. But our exams, which are curriculum based and involve a lot of writing, and so on, are not yet there.
So you're saying how things happen at the moment is a little bit out of date?
Absolutely. It is out of date. And we sort of say, but everybody's on screen all the time. And it's true, everybody is on screen all the time. But most young people are not typing on a laptop most of the time. If they're on screens, it's a small thing and they're using their thumbs. They're not able to type quickly. So there's an open question about how we make sure that students are prepared to sit and do GCSE English on a screen. Do we bring back typing lessons from primary school to get students able to touch type? Because touch typing is not currently part of the construct that's being assessed in GCSE English, for instance. But should it be? And if it should, well, then we need to be teaching it.
Ruth Johnson, very interesting. Thanks very much for talking to us. If you appreciated hearing Ruth's thoughts and want to learn more, head to the OECD website, oecd.org, where you can search for our report, The Theory and Practice of Upper Secondary Certification. More insights there on exams and assessments and keeping them fair and credible. The link is also in the blurb for this podcast. If you enjoyed our top class podcast, give us a like, tell your friends, let people know about us, and do join us for another episode soon.